This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
It was kind of a lucky thing for me. The timing was right. I had the writing skill, and I also had an intense curiosity and interest about computers and programming. Unfortunately, the amateur computer programmer is a memory, really. If some kid gets into computing now, he faces a lot of algebra and a lot of other hurdles that are meaningless, but they're there.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Richard Mansfield is author of the best-selling book Machine Language for Beginners and its sequel, Compute's second book of machine language, both published by Compute Books. He also wrote Apple Machine Language for Beginners, Commodore 128 Machine Language for Beginners, and a bevy of other computer books continuing right up through today. Richard was also a longtime editor of Compute magazine. This interview took place on March 17, 2016.
Well, I was a somewhat confused English major, and when I was getting my doctorate in English from the University of California, Santa Barbara. But there weren't a whole lot of, even back then, not too many job prospects. And I didn't really want to teach. I'd done some teaching at the university, student teaching type thing. And I just didn't care for it much. I didn't know what I wanted to do or what I wanted to be, but that was in the early 70s. And then about 8 years of doing nothing really, just sort of drifting around, I finally started the ads for the first home computers, that you could buy. The old Commodore, I think it was 16K or 32K. But anyway, I went to Philadelphia and bought one of those. And then I found out that, and this is also at the same time pretty close to when we first started selling affordable calculators, electronic calculators.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I've been an English major and really didn't do that well in math, I found myself fascinated by the combination of a machine and computation, more or less. I was kind of afraid it might be really mathematical, but it turns out, as you know, computing isn't in any sense mathematical any more than the library is mathematical. You can find math books there. It's not the purpose of a computer to do math. It's incidental to, even though these days they always somehow they hijack computing into the math departments of most universities. I don't quite understand why, since it's really a communication, a linguistic thing, programming. There are aspects surely of advanced math in some areas of computing, but for most purposes, you can be an English major and grasp all you need to do programming. So anyway, that's what I turned out that I discovered something that really fascinated me a lot. So I just worked at it, learned assembly language, and just dove into it, kind of like just we spent all my time for about 6 months doing nothing but just investigating this new machine, which was quite primitive by the base standard, but it did have the capability of being programmed. You had to save your programs onto tape, little cassette tapes. It's like music cassette tapes and all that back then. But anyway, so then I got the idea, well, I think I'll write a book since I know how to write. I was an English major, and now I know machine language, assembly language. So, and I went over to State College, which was near about. I live in a little town in Pennsylvania, and I went over to State College, and there were just zero books on computers, in programming or anything. There just weren't any in the Walden bookstore. So I thought, well, somebody ought to write a book on programming, and luckily, that was all sort of starting to catch fire at that point. The whole thing of personal computing. So I started. I had no idea really how to write books, so I counted the number of words in a normal book. So I'd have an idea of the scale I was dealing with in this. I just had no idea. So I started writing this book, and I wrote a few chapters, and I contacted a couple of early computer magazines, one called Creative Computing, and they wanted to interview me to do some editing for them. And I'd have to move to New Jersey, which was really expensive, really close to New York City. And then also I sent an article to Compute, which was just starting as the first issue, actually. But I was buying everything on the subject, so I sent an article. And then Robert Luck, who was starting Compute magazine, thought that my writing was real clear, which wasn't at that time typical of writing about computers. They tended to be heavily influenced by jargon and IBM, the IBM business universe, So it was kind of a lucky thing for me. The timing was right. I had the writing skill, and I also had an intense curiosity and interest about computers and programming. So my first book came out about a year after I moved down to Compute, called Machine Language for Beginners, and partly because there was no competition at all, it became a really big bestseller. I was hauling in amazing amounts of money, like $30,000 a quarter.
Wow!
But it was selling out all over the time. It's just one of those things where you're at the right place with the right abilities. And nowadays, hundreds, maybe tens of thousands of guys writing computer books just as good as I could. But like I say, I was on the top of a wave. And also, I was one of the first employees at Compute, so I got to be the editor at Compute, and we expanded quite rapidly, and a bunch of different magazines devoted to each individual early personal computers, and Atari, and even the IBM PC, which was a pretty big failure, but we had a magazine for anything that came along. We also had a book division with 100 titles, pretty much covering, again, all these different areas, and somewhat recycling some of the articles we published. I wrote several books at that time, and we had all the computers there in our little computing lab in the office, and we hired some really bright high school kids that come in and test games and things. And it just sort of exploded, and we were lucky enough to be there at the right time. So that's sort of a summary of how I got launched into this. And when we stopped publishing, I stayed with Robert Luck in several different magazines and another company that we founded together, although he was really the brains behind the business part of it. I just was luckily enough. We were real close friends, so he made me a partner in his new business after he sold Compute to ABC Publishing. But anyway, when the 90s came around, 1990s, that was sort of the end of my being in a company. And so I just started writing books 100% of the time, which actually suited me better. Because the same reason I didn't like teaching, I didn't particularly like being in a company. I didn't like any of the business aspects of it, and I didn't like the cruelty of having people work for much less money than I was making, but, working harder, actually. And I saw the whole structure as, kind of unpleasant. I certainly didn't like being a boss of anybody, but I had to, you just get, life puts you in places. I tried to be as compassionate as I could without, turning into a flaming communist or something. But anyway, that's just, I went to be a full-time writer in the 90s, and I've done that ever since. Written 46 books.
Nice. Yeah, I was looking on Amazon. There's just book after book that you've written over the years, VBA and for Microsoft Office and programming and just stuff going all the way back to Machine Language for Beginners. Are you still writing books today?
Well, actually, now that I'm 70 years old, so everything is slowed down. I used to do about 3 a year, which is a somewhat embarrassing statistic because it pushes you into the category of at least people might begin to wonder if maybe you're a hack instead of a writer. But now I've slowed down. I'm not doing 3 years. I'm doing. I basically last year all I did was a revision of one of the books I did before. Because of the new Microsoft Office suite. And also I'm doing an online course in XML programming for this online university thing they do. And then I'm self-publishing a book unrelated to computer programming about because when I was in Pennsylvania in my confused period during the 70s when I had no real direction, other than knowing I didn't want to teach. And for an English major, you as a teacher, right? There's not a whole lot of other. There is advertising, but anyway, I ran a diner for a while in the city town in central Pennsylvania, and picked up a number of good recipes for diner-type food, which is essentially comfort food type stuff. It's in the category of high school cafeteria food, but it has to be somewhat more. Well, the thing I learned from that, aside from a bunch of good recipes, was the biggest thing in restaurants is you have to be consistent. Because the trucker will come back 6 months later and really want the exact same macaroni and cheese. And it's really hard to get consistency when you're dealing with minimum wage help. Because they don't, they'll say, I'll just throw this on it. That's enough salt. They don't have the ability to even taste it and tell whether there's enough salt.
Right.
So I learned stuff there. I'm doing a book on that now. But it'll just be self-published.
Nice.
So that's pretty much the overview.
All right. So let's get into some specifics then. I just right out the gate, machine language for beginners, I don't have numbers, but it seems like it was a huge seller, and they're still everywhere. They're easy to find, so that makes me think that it sold super well. And then you came out with the second book of machine language.
Right, that's about half as many, because there still was a kind of a dearth of information on programming.
Right.
And there was a great surge. It was strange to me because the surge occurred. People, compute suddenly was having 300,000 circulation, all within about a year. My books were flying off the shelves, anything on the subject. And it seemed like there was this enormous home computing interest. It seemed like the whole country, there was a certain number of people that just, loved the idea of programming and writing their own programs. But for some reason, after about 8 or 9 years, that whole thing faded. And it's almost like the youngsters now just aren't interested in it. They might be interested in programming, but if they are, they go into the math department, and that sort of bores a lot of them. And the professional programming, this has happened so often through history that I should have known it. I should have been able to predict it, but I never thought it would fade away the way it did. All the magazines dying out eventually, and the interest in the amateur concept of amateur programming. Yeah, I don't think it ever went away. I think what happened was it happened in Egypt, it happened in the Middle Ages. If people can make money off something, then they tend to quickly develop an obscuring quality. They don't want you to be able to understand what they're doing.
Right.
Otherwise, you wouldn't pay them if you could do it. If you could type the word print into a computer and it printed what was on the screen, that would eliminate a certain number of jobs. And so what comes up, what happens is a kind of guild-like thing where only those in the know. Like back in Egypt, you had to go to a priest and get in a bowl of dates before you could make a request to the sun god. You couldn't directly talk to the sun god. And they would talk in some obscure secret priest language. In fact, they turned their back on you and mumbled. So your ability to speak to your, and in the computer in the same way, your ability to write a program for it has been more or less, hijacked by the academic world that makes money teaching all these unrelated things you have to learn before you can program. I mean,
Right.
what does calculus have to do with? But you see, it's a way of weeding out people and keeping job security. And then the same thing happens in the commercial software business, places that sell software to businesses. They also have a huge wall of obscurity, preventing the businessman from understanding that what they're doing is really hocus pocus. It's not. There's nothing confusing or mysterious about programming, but boy, they really like to think that they're geniuses for being able to do it, and that's how they get paid. So I understand the phenomenon of candle makers and guild membership and all that. But it's kind of an ugly thing about humanity that when there is something that people could do and enjoy, it gets more or less dismantled for commercial reasons and for personal gain.
Right. Yeah.
And that's another side effect of that is the destruction of the basic language, which is a very sensible language, and which I continue to work in and enjoy. And the development of pseudo obscure symbols and all the ridiculous things that other languages like C impose on a programmer. When BASIC uses the word "and" to stop the program, but it's not the sort of thing the boss would pay you for. So you have to have all this elaborate, basically BS that goes on with the programming languages that are. A programming language, the computer doesn't have any interest in. It doesn't care what word you use to describe stopping, halting the program.
Right.
But in order to save their jobs, they make up all kinds of elaborate punctuation and ridiculous. And really, it should have been from the beginning the goal to make computers understand dealing with language. And that was the goal of the people who started writing BASIC. They wanted to make it as English-like as possible and punctuated as much like English.
Mm-hmm.
Ostensibly, when you pressed carriage return, that was the end of the line. You didn't have to worry about semicolons and other ridiculous stuff. But anyway, I'm kind of a curmudgeon when it comes to the way that the whole thing has just changed so much from the pleasure. I think there'd still be a big audience for popular computing were there any possibility that would lead you to a career in computing. But if there isn't, you have to go through. You can't just like to program and even be skilled at programming. You have to be skilled at all sorts of unrelated and ancillary things to get through the academic community.
Yeah. Tell me a story about working at Compute. I tell you, when I was a kid reading the magazine, I imagined your computer lab filled with one of every different computer, but I realized that, it was an office and you're accepting articles and just doing officey things. But tell me something about day-to-day life at the magazine.
Well, it was really a lot of fun to work there. Partly for me it was fun because I was our boss, but I also think it was fun we tried to make it fun anyway for all the people who worked there. We were very careful and cautious about who we hired, and over the period of hiring 120 or 150 people, we made a few mistakes, but for the most part we got bright, energetic, and pleasant people, and so people look forward to coming to work there because, for obvious reasons, if you were interested in computing and programming, that was a great place to be because you got all the software free. You got it, a couple months usually before anyone else could see it. It's all the advantages of, working in a record store. It's just, you get a lot. If you love music, you want to be where it is, and that's what these people were mostly. Of course, there were other people. We had one guy, Charles Brown. He was a wonderful programmer, and he really wasn't interested in academics, but he loved computers, and he was so good at it. He could go to, we'd send him to a conference or something, and he would see the new machine, and it was almost like his brain sort of flowed into the machine and took on its contours because he'd come back being able to more or less describe it from an interior point of view, not just its capabilities, that you'd find on a press release, but actually the the shape of it, the hardware and software interrelationships and all these things that would make sense to a nerd, but weren't on the press release. And he was clever too and witty. He wrote a little program. When we get a new secretary, he'd go in and he'd tell her, just be, everything's, this is a computer, and I know you're nervous, but don't be nervous. Just never press the function key at the same time that you press the F2 key. And she'd say, well, this isn't like a typewriter, F2 function. I'll just try to remember not to do that. He said, well, here, if you ever do that, it will loosen the letters on the screen, and they'll fall off. So he made a little program that he would then, a few days later, put in her computer. And at a certain point in the day, all of us would be sort of wandering, hovering nearby. Sure enough, one of the letter E's and one of her, and whatever she was typing, would start to swing back and forth like it was unstable, and then it would sort of bounce down off the screen. And she, because we'd comfort them and tell them no, but that was so clever. And we just had a lot of fun, and we, like I said, we had a pretty large lab that we used, and we'd have multiple, every machine we'd have several because the people were writing programs for the magazine and reviewing submissions that came in for the magazine. So it was a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. We always felt like we were right on the edge of things. And we went through the cycles that came on, that first everybody had to type it in the programs, and then after that we were able to finally get them on media. But we had these checksums that you could use to help you figure out if you made a mistake typing.
Right.
Oh, it was just a very primitive kind of cartoon-like behavior. But we ended up going through the whole thing to the point where, a decade later, it was getting really sophisticated. And even for the home, person. But we did a lot of books, and we met a lot of these people. We had people like that AOL guy, Case, was that his name? Would come visit us. People would, just come by because we had a magazine that was one of few. So we'd get visits from bigwigs, and we'd go to all the conferences, and it was just, that was a great part of it. I mean, like I said, the people were, for the most part, with a couple of exceptions, people were really nice. And we had a couple that had meltdowns, but I think we get to a certain spot.
Just like meltdowns, working too hard kind of meltdowns, or?
No, I don't think so. Because all of us were pretty enthusiastic workers, just because and I'm not by nature a hard worker, but the subject is so interesting to me that I think most of the others are the same way. We had one lady that worked there. She wasn't actually in the computing part of it. She wasn't working real hard, but she started to wear the same dress every day. And after about a month, her supervisor had to ask her, and she got real defensive. She said, I had it dry cleaned all the time. And we were a little bit worried that, maybe she was drifting into a thing. And then there was somebody else started having, just a real breakdown, and they were, it wasn't related to the work. It was just that they started getting, messages through the radio. Mm-hmm. And that was sad. But I think that one was cured by medicine. But that's the whole thing. You get classes. When I was in the college, I would teach these classes, freshman classes in English. You always have one or two that really make life kind of nerve-wracking for everybody else because they're either boring and they talk too much, or they have a strange way of walking sideways along the wall or something. I mean, there's always something you get with people. So that's why writing was always a good thing for me at the end. The last 2 decades, I haven't had any. I haven't had to deal with people, which is my preference. I'm really not that social.
I get that.
And every time I've had to do it, one person, I got accused of some things by some people, toward the end when we had 100 and some people. One lady accused me of plagiarism, and writing is very easy for me, so plagiarism isn't an issue. Well, it would never happen. I wouldn't need to. People who plagiarize are usually struggling, right? They have a hard time writing, and they think there's only one best way to say something, so they look at someone else's work and plop that into there. And it turns out that what I had done is I quoted an article in the magazine in one of my books. But I quoted it. I put a footnote that it came from this issue in the magazine. We owned the rights to it. I mean, there was no question of plagiarism. It was just a paragraph that I said right in the book. I said, this was published in our magazine by so-and-so. And then I put the paragraph in and she accused me. So it's just, I'm sure when you get with people, there's going to be messes of some kind.
Yeah.
And I found that really boring. And I only liked, I'd say, about 20% of the people personally. The others I either didn't know or didn't have any interest in knowing. And so the ones that I liked, we're still friends. And we even had a reunion about, I guess, a year ago now. One of us moved out to California and had to come back here for something. And so we all got together and had a big reunion. And some of us still, go out a couple times a year to lunch. So we were pretty close.
Nice.
I know some juicy scandals, but I really can't say that. I can't talk about them.
All right. No.
Because there was some scandal.
You said you had your hand in some of the other books as an editor. Do you remember if you had anything to do with any of the many Atari books that Compute put out?
No, I don't remember. In fact, it's unlikely I would, because by the time we were doing Atari, I had sort of we had so many editors by that time that I wouldn't have been actually editing a book directly. I would just an editor might ask me some questions, but I wouldn't. We had technical editors who would follow the regular editors that were editing for clarity and logic and organization. They were English majors, and we had copy editors who would check, the lower level stuff like proofreading and grammar and that stuff. And then we had a technical editor staff. So our books went through a process of several editors before it got to the artists who would put it together into a book. And so, but on my role as sort of a general editor, I mean, we also had a book editor who supervised the book editors, and so it had turned into a hierarchy, and I was just the editor. So, the book editor reported to me, and the magazine editors reported to me, and I reported to Robert. So it was turned into a hierarchy, a tree structure.
Sure.
So no, I didn't have any.
And you were there until Compute was sold to ABC, is that right?
Yeah, and then we had to sign an agreement to stay on 5 more years as part of the sale. Mm-hmm. Because all that they're buying is the gestalt between all of us workers. There wasn't anything else to buy. We weren't a building or anything. They were just buying our interaction and skill. And so we had to sign, a certain number of people had to sign an agreement to stay for 5 years. And when that period was up, Robert decided to start another company, and what we did was took a sort of a left turn and went into game magazines. We had a couple of magazines about game, just showing them how to go through games. In other words, we'd have a comic book like several pages of screens showing how to solve a game. And we also had a magazine like Sports Illustrated for kids. Just a couple, sort of books and magazines again, but on topics not directly in competition with Compute group. And that went on for another, I guess, 6 or 7 years, something like that. And that was, and then that's when after that, I ejected into the world of just being at my house and writing books, here. Still did all a slower pace now.
Yeah.
Occasionally I'll walk out. See, the thing I like most is being able to, if I feel like a nap, I just walk about 20 feet down the hall to my bedroom and have a nap. And if I want to, I go out on the veranda. So then I'll wake, and somebody will hold my finger up in the air, and a butterfly lands on it. You probably want to cut that part out. But those are the picture. A schematic picture. Anyway, but that's what it is. It's a solitude. I have, two roommates, and my mom lived here until she died. So there's enough people around for me.
Where? What state are you in?
North Carolina. That's where Compute was.
Right. Yeah. Nice.
We're in Greensboro.
So were you there? I don't remember at what point Compute decided to stop running type-in listings and kind of became a more boring magazine. Were you still there at that point?
Yeah, I was there the whole time as it evolved, and what we did was we sort of replaced that with CDs that were built into the magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And the internet wasn't around yet, so we couldn't do anything that way.
Right.
We couldn't have downloading or anything, but we did make a transition to CDs. At that point, too, CDs were unstable, and they had to build these strange factories on springs. The floor had to be on springs in order to be able to make a CD, because the laser would go crazy if it got any vibrations from highways or anything like that, or wind or anything. It was all very, elaborate. Now you can, make your own CDs, but in those days there was it was quite expensive. And I remember one time when they were first putting out hard drives, they wheeled in this thing that was half the size of a refrigerator and told us that we could test it. It was their brand new, gigantic 5,000 byte hard drive, and it was this big gray monster, and it looked amazing. I mean, we saw 5,000. In those days, you'd think 20,000 kilobytes. How could anybody ever need that much space? That's how. And every byte counted when you were programming too. And everybody was running around worrying about using up every little byte in your program. Robert teased me when that $5,000 gigantic thing came in and said that it had broken, and they're going to have to tell him that it was broken. But he knew I was real strict about being honest and stuff, and so he was just trying to tease me. He said that I had bumped into it or something.
Jeez.
But it was okay. There's a lot, there's certain things that, like debris from those days, that are still bothering people. Like they had to use the zeroth byte, and for some odd reason they decided to start certain lists with zero. As you know, in programming, some arrays are zero-based, for example, as opposed to being one-based.
Right.
Which is caused countless programming errors over the years, but some languages still enforce that crazy rule that you can't, that your loop has to be adjusted by one off, because the array doesn't start with 1. So you can't say count from 1 to 10. You have to say count from 0 to 9, which is pretty crazy. But there's stuff like that still floats around in programming as a result of need to conserve memory in the early days. You couldn't ignore that zeroth bit, And then, of course, that contributed to the joyful confusion that the professional programmers like to perpetuate if possible.
Do you have any old computers anymore?
I don't. I'm not one to keep things really. So, but I know one of our editors, Tom Halfwell, kept all the issues with computers. And he kept a bunch of old machines, and so did Charles Vernon, another close friend of mine at his company. He kept a lot of machines. And then Tom ended up, he lives out in San Francisco, so he's in this, what do they call it, Silicon Valley area. So there's a museum of early computing out there, and he donated all the computes to that.
Nice.
I think some of his machines he donated to that museum, too, so that they'd be preserved.
What haven't I asked you about Compute and your books that I should have?
Well, that's a very good question. Book writing is so radically different now. That's one thing that I would ask an elderly writer. I would say, well, how has it changed, Richard? since when you first started publishing in a more traditional book publishing environment, now where people are self-publishing right and left. And I think it's a great thing in a way because I like using a Kindle and I like the lightness of a library, on 6 ounces of plastic. I love that concept, and I like books to be convenient, but I also like, books as books. So it's sort of nostalgic for me. But, when we got the first cable TVs were put in back in the 70s, we went from 2 over-the-air channels to like 8 channels, and we thought it was fabulous. But at that time, I began to see what was happening. I thought, well, this is a kind of a continual bifurcation where there's going to be atomizing and what we now call digitalization. Things don't have any inherent reality; they're just sort of dancing dots of light. And but one effect that's going to have on, and it's happening with books now because you've got these people publishing highly specific channels of writing that didn't exist, couldn't have existed when you had to pay someone to put print on paper. It would have been way too expensive to have a book on avocado growing for lesbians, for example, or robot sexual attacks in Europe. I mean, these highly specific topics are now possible. And I thought, well, when we got the cable TV, I thought, well, yeah, one day there'll be like 40,000 channels because it'll be more like a library where you don't have to wait a week or two for another movie. You just go in and take it anytime you want. So there'll be a channel on TV for the Jeffersons, and every sorry comedy that ever came along will have its own channel.
And it's kind of like that now with video on demand. That's the thing now.
That's happening now, and because of the multiplication that digitalization makes possible, you have even the cable TV channels are starting to get a channel just devoted to ancient talk shows, like Merv Griffin's show is now on out here on a daily basis, and Johnny Carson and all that. But it'll go a little bit further to where there'll be just one channel for Merv Griffin, and one channel for the movies of Betty Grable and stuff like that. So you'll have like a zillion channels, and in that case, it won't be any more on-demand issue. It'll be just, it'll be like a library. You just go right to a certain spot, and you've got a very specific book. Now, the same thing's happening with books, because you've got all this self-publishing. And they made it so easy with Amazon. They've got this, all this stuff that helps you, put a book together. So you really don't need publishers. You can go directly to the readers, and that's why the readers can be asking you to do something really specific, because there's no cost. It's just like there's no cost for photography anymore. There's no cost to develop a book either.
Right.
And you just, you're going to have these lesbian avocado growers are going to be really happy because it'll speak directly to their interests, and their way of growing avocados is quite clearly going to be different from let's say, somebody working in Russia, where growing avocados has to be done according to a certain plan and certain rules. Whereas, as you know, the lesbians can be kind of cavalier about their way of
That's
growing.
true. That's really true. They make the best avocados. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got all these narrow niches now in publishing as well. So what happened to photography a little bit earlier is now happening to the printed word.
Mm-hmm.
It's becoming dirt cheap, and everybody's doing it. No, I don't regret that at all. I think that's great. It's a form of, Democritus, that old philosopher that thought everything was in little packets and stuff way before we knew it was. Democracy in all these forms of art is ultimately a good thing because there'll still be competition.
Mm-hmm.
But it'll be far more satisfying because you'll be able to find things more specifically related to your particular slant on things.
Absolutely. So when you kind of brought up something before. When you wrote Machine Language for Beginners, how were you writing it? Were you submitting it digitally or on paper? Because I would hate for some low-level entry person to have to rekey all that machine language code. That just seems terrible.
Oh, it was terrible, but there's the same thing. The readers of the magazine had to do all that. And the readers of my book had to do that. They had to key in all this stuff.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that.
Yeah, I had a program in the second book that was an actual working assembler program that you could use that used mnemonics, short.
Mm-hmm. Right, the WADS assembler.
Right, that one, and they had to. There was this massive thing. They had to type in all the text on it, I think, and stuff like that. And the same thing we had. We had a couple, three. We had four. I guess two sisters and a couple others. They were just their job was to set up a linotype machine and put in the magazine. And it wasn't. I don't know if it was any more tedious to do the code listings than it would be to do the actual magazine itself. But they had to sit there, and they were called. Their job was doomed. It was gone 2 or 3 years later. But there were still people that would type in codes and keys and things to lay out a page, and they were called. What were they called? I forget they had a name, but their job died.
I just thought they were linotype operators, but if there's a more specific name, I don't know it.
I think for the people who keyed it in, there was another name. But anyway, whatever it was, they had a big machine. It was like a typewriter that had gone crazy, and it was a huge thing. And they would then everything was set in lead, and I was all very primitive by our standards. But no, I had to write it on a typewriter and then just use whiteout and stuff. That's how I like to type things. So I didn't do it by longhand, but I did type it out and had to make corrections the old-fashioned way.
Nice. And was the magazine done just on paste-up board and stuff?
Oh yeah.
Wow.
The first few years, it was these giant white boards, and then the stuff would come back we had to check it, and it would come back pasted on these big boards, and had to look at it and make sure things went wrong. Yeah. Our worst nightmare came true about the 4th year. We were publishing a lot, but we were real careful about quality. And on the cover of one of the compute magazines, the headline misspelled the word satellite. And I'll never forget the amount of consternation in the copy editing department.
For the word satellite?
Yeah, the word satellite was misspelled.
Oh no.
And because there weren't any, spelling checkers or anything that copy editors were responsible for that. And they took their job with a grim seriousness. I mean, don't tell copy editors about moving a comma because they'd freak out. And these days, it's much less use for them. Now, probably even the regular traditional publishing houses, like I read a book to McGraw-Hill about 3 years ago, and they're as traditional as a publisher can get. They're not like Wiley. Wiley's more modern, but McGraw-Hill's an ancient company, and they don't at least on my book, they didn't have any copy editing as such. They didn't even have an editor, really. It was just a person who combined those two jobs. Mm-hmm. And then there was a technical editor who more or less took on the job of ordering the book logically, which would normally be an editor's job. But the technical editor had to, I think the reasoning is that how would a regular non-technical editor know what was illogical in a book on technical subjects? Mm-hmm. But I don't know. But anyway, they cut down their staff quite a bit. And then, of course, they farmed out now the publishers have farmed out their art, and the people that put the book together and design it. That goes to India now, in India.
Right.
And, they certainly, and for the most part, you can't really farm out editing to India because they have trouble with our idioms. They know English, but it's not American English. It doesn't understand the concept of a lazy dog or anything. If he said something idiomatic, they wouldn't deal with it.
Right. The satellite debacle notwithstanding, the compute covers were always amazing, and there was a consistency across the years. You guys stuck with the same artist, Blair, I think.
Right.
And that was, I don't know, part of the best, one of the best things about the magazine until you opened it up, and then there was all the great content too. But
well, thank you. I know that's one of the brilliant things that Robert did. He was a very, very intelligent man and very thoughtful person. I'm not particularly thoughtful in the sense that I don't sit down and think things through for a half hour a day. He did. And that's why he was so original in some ways. He was the first person to use punctuation. Computer always had a title of it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he also wanted to make sure that computing didn't seem threatening or technical, so he wanted to have cartoons on the cover. So he got Harry a local cartoonist and had him always do the look of the magazine on the cover, and also sometimes on the inside somewhat. And he also did some of he illustrated my first book. Harry did. So that was one way of softening, making compute more, making it seem more accessible, and and it worked very well. Robert did a lot of interesting things. I mean, if you got me started on Robert, I'd tell you a lot of other stuff, because he was really the engine that visualized the whole thing and understood the implications. It was, that Jeff Bezos guy that is always ahead of the curve. And, I mean, he's talking about going to Mars or something. I mean, talk about being ahead of the curve. And Robert was like that in publishing. He'd come up with some really amazingly original stuff, things that you and I would never think of. I mean, I don't know you, but I'm just saying that he was a rare person out there. He fully grasped the situation. I don't know how he ever did it, because he'd never done any publishing. He was a young guy behind. He was 2 years younger than I am. And we were both, in our early 30s when we got together. And how he understood distribution and at the same time could deal with content. He was like an editor/businessman. He was like both. He could do both. And he had very good instincts about what to do, both in the business and in the creative side of things. That's why he would, he kind of let me and Kathleen Martin deal with some hiring. He didn't take us into that. So we would decide who to hire. And also he kind of left the editorial side. But he gave direction. It was like the relationship between somebody who would chart the course and then somebody else who would actually steer the ship. And so, as long as things didn't go off course, he would not be involved. But boy, is he good at the course setting. He was very good. He always, he would say, he would suddenly say, let's do this kind of book. Let's change the way this does. And it would be something other people would then later copy. And that's something he doesn't get much credit for. And then when we started at ABC, they got on their own team of managers who were supposed to be telling me what to do and stuff, but that didn't work out too well. I think I better stop there.
All right. So if you could send a message to the people who read your books and magazine and are now listening to this, what would you tell them?
Well, I tell them I wish their kids and grandkids could have the same amount of fun that they had with computing, because it's turned now into a kind of ossified, heavily academic commercial thing. And unfortunately, the amateur computer programmer is a memory, really. If some kid gets into computing now, he faces a lot of algebra and a lot of other hurdles that are meaningless, but they're there. So it kind of there is no real amateur programming anymore. I mean, there are people who start out, and they might read a book like the book I wrote called Introduction to Programming for McGraw-Hill. They might read that book and get really enthusiastic, but then they suddenly see, I've heard this from kids, they see a wall of nonsense and chaos and years of meaninglessness before they can actually do some professional programming. They face a kind of really, well, if I were that kid, I would have never gone into programming now, because I would have enjoyed the first book or two and a little bit maybe of my own programming at home, but I would see it strictly as a hobby, not as a pathway to any kind of career. And if I say it, I think that would be the thing. I'm glad that you were able to get in on the on the fun and the joy of programming for its own pleasure. But now that it's programming for money or academic success, it's really 90% not programming. One of the people who used to work at Computer Lessons was pretty high up in the company, went to a large international corporation after Compute closed down, and he told me one time, he said, he said, this company is run like such a machine that I know exactly what I'm going to be working on and doing in pretty precise terms a year from now on Thursday.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you get into that situation, and even if you succeed in becoming a professional programmer, in many of those contexts, you are so heavily governed by the system itself that your creativity is almost not there. So creative computing and personal computing, I think, have simply been killed. And I would just say that somebody reading Compute back then, you were lucky to be in a period of time when amateurs were allowed to, write programs for their own sake, rather than the way it is now. I know I sound like an old geezer, and I've heard geezers say this a lot, in different contexts. But there's some truth to it. Change isn't always preserve the best things about something. And heaven knows computing now is largely governed by. And of course, they're going to end up giving way to the computer itself, which will no longer need programming. Mm-hmm. Once natural language is solved for the artificial intelligent computer, they won't even need to have any programmers, or even in the IT departments for that matter. But we're in a phase now where we still do programming, but it's, like I say, it's turned into a fascistic thing.
Yeah. Well, I think I have what I need, Richard. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I enjoyed talking to you.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.